Perfect. Thank you. Let me turn on my camera. Good morning and good evening for those who are joining us from India. So good morning and good evening to all of you. Thanks. First of all, truly wanted to welcome and thanks all of you for joining us today. This is our second virtual event this year from a Philadelphia chapter standpoint. We met earlier. If you joined us in March when we had a kickoff meeting for the Philadelphia chapter, so we asked for some topics of interest of what people would like to more listen in the future events, and integration was one of the topics that came up very loud, that people are more interested to understand and find out more how UiPath integrates with some of the standard applications. And that's how we took that feedback and then planned for this session to talk about two major applications which we typically use in every organization, which is ServiceNow and SAP, even though some organizations may be using a different version of these processes. Some may not be using SAP, but some other ERPs, or some may not be using the ServiceNow, but some other help desk tool, but it's something similar, right? So that we thought it's a pretty good topic that to talk about integration, and UiPath has done pretty decent job in the last few years to come up with the standard best practices around integrating with these tools. So we will talk more on ServiceNow and SAP today, and I highly suggest it to be more interactive. We recommend feedback, questions during the session. However, since we are doing a Zoom, I would suggest use the Zoom chat to type in your questions, and then we'll take it as it comes in so that we can at least first finish the topic, the presentation and the demo, and then we'll start taking the questions. But feel free to start putting your thoughts, your questions in the Zoom chat as it comes in. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and then quickly introduce our agenda for today. So hopefully you guys can see my screen. So today we're going to talk about, like I said, two integration services. The main topic would be ServiceNow and SAP, and then we'll take the Q&A at the end, or as it comes in. Feel free to come off mute if you need to ask any quick question. Happy to answer, and or we're going to take it at the end in the Q&A, and then we will talk about some of the upcoming events we're planning from a Philadelphia chapter standpoint. From the speaker standpoint, just wanted to quickly introduce, we have Mukesh Kala, who is a seasoned RPA developer. And I've known Mukesh for quite some time. He is a UiPath YouTuber. He's 2 times UiPath MVP. And I think it's amazing the type of videos and the topics he presents on YouTube. In fact, I myself have listened to his topics many times to learn. So we are happy to have you, Mukesh, joined us today. Thank you. I know it's late for you in the India time, but truly appreciate you coming in and speaking about ServiceNow in this event. I'll be talking about SAP. I work as Senior Director for the ERP systems at Lucien. We are SAP customer for last 15 years. We are also UiPath customer for a couple of years, and heavily investing our time and effort all around SAP and UiPath integration. So that's where I wanted to share my experience. And I'm also the UiPath MVP for this year and the Philadelphia chapter leader. So that's where I'm more interested in taking with the community, with the networking, and also to share my experience and our experience, how SAP and UiPath interact. So that's quick introduction about us from a speaker standpoint. So I'll quickly start, and from a ServiceNow and SAP, we'll take first the SAP side in the next maybe 15 to 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I'll talk about SAP. The way we're going to run it today is we're going to use some slides to just quickly give some introduction, some context around the topic, but then the most part of it, we're going to jump into the system so we can show you some real life examples as well as some lessons learned, some quick pointers, how to make it work, how does integration work between UiPath and SAP. That's how I'm going to run my, and then sure Mukesh is going to do the same thing with some slides, and then he'll walk you through how to build some standard integration between UiPath and ServiceNow. So on my SAP side, more going to talk about in general, what is UiPath and SAP doing in the market space. What is SAP architecture? I wouldn't spend too much time on teaching on the SAP side, but just want to quickly touch upon how SAP is structured and how automation fits into that space. What are the typical prerequisites we are seeing that when you start integrating, what are the prerequisites you have to keep in mind to do some adjustments and settings on the SAP side? And then what are the different approaches, best practices, how to automate, whether to use a UI UX automation versus APIs, RFCs. So what is recommended under what situation? So we're going to talk all about in the next 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll switch on to my system to give you some live demo on that. From a SAP standpoint, UiPath is a certified partner with SAP. So what it means is certification means that SAP has certified UiPath that its solution can automate most of the SAP products, whether it's on-prem or if it's a cloud SAP solution. UiPath is a certified partner for UI from a SAP standpoint. So there are SAP solutions. If you are a SAP customer, if you're familiar with the SAP products, SAP provides both on-prem and cloud solution from an ERP standpoint. There are other solutions SAP provide, which are like a solution manager, which you use for your day-to-day change management, for your documentation standpoint. And also there are other solutions like Concur for the travel and expenses, and SuccessFactors as the HRIS system. So UiPath has certification on almost every SAP application. And as part of that, as I'm showing on the slide as an example, UiPath recently announced some standard SAP accelerators, which if you install, basically brings in pre-built, predefined containers or framework to automate most of the day-to-day SAP transactions. So I highly recommend going through the UiPath marketplace and then navigate it. It talks about what is the prerequisites, what type of processes are included, how to automate it. It's a nice documentation there. And then it covers most of the SAP applications like ECC from a finance standpoint, SuccessFactors. So that's definitely a good starter for anybody who's looking to automate SAP, is to start navigating into marketplace and then start reading about the standard accelerators UiPath provides for SAP. And then quickly talking about the SAP architecture, if you, from any ERP standpoint, right? So it basically has three-tier architecture, right? We have presentation layer, we have application layer, and then we have a database layer, right? So it's a very standard three-tier landscape architecture for any ERP system, and SAP follows the same methodology. When it comes to presentation layer, we talk about the end user UI UX automation, which end user, how they interact, could be a desktop, web-based GUI, and there are automations based on how user interact with the system, right? And the use case typically I have seen in my company for that type of automation is when it's a hybrid, attended, user and interactive, where bot starts some process, user takes over in the middle, and then again hand over the remaining portion of the process to a bot. So it's more like a hybrid user interaction. That's the benefit of that. But of course, as you can imagine, it's highly dependent on how stable your GUI is, how stable your browser settings are. Anytime you change, there's a new patch, new setting comes in, it's always a risk of automation to fail because you may have to go back and adjust that. So there are pros and cons. I just want to highlight that the type of automation you want to do depends on your use case, and then every has its own pros and cons. The second layer on the SAP side comes in, we call it the application layer, where you can bypass the presentation side and directly interact more like an APIs, backend kind of an interaction, right? Where you can have some remote function calls or APIs directly interacting from a UiPath to SAP and then do an automation. And that most of it, at least in our company, we're using that approach when it comes to unattended, where we don't need any user interaction. We typically would prefer to use that type of an automation. And the major benefit for that is it's much faster. I'll show you in my demo. If we are to automate the same process using UI UX versus API call, it's much faster, less, more stable, standard procedure. It's very rare that SAP would change any APIs. They hardly go and adjust any existing standard API. So it's less error prone or risk for failure, because even if you upgrade your SAP system, it's less likely that it's going to change any of the standard APIs, right? So that means you have more stability on your automation to run without any reason for it to fail, right? But it all depends on the use cases, right? So that I just want to quickly highlight here in this slide. The next one is more like I touched briefly earlier. If you look at the SAP standpoint, there are many SAP solutions, SAP products, and some of those products still use the traditional Windows-based GUI. Some are now using the latest GUI called Web GUI. Some are using like SAP Business Client and then traditional like a browser-based GUI. So the purpose of this slide is all type of user interfaces SAP support can be automated using UiPath, whether it's a SAP S/4HANA or SAP on-prem traditional ECC software or SAP Ariba, Fieldglass, Concur. Every solution we are seeing that since it's a consistent web interface, UiPath has either a standard connector or mechanism to automate any of those interfaces. In the next slide is more, just wanted to quickly touch upon, if you're looking for more in non-user interface, right, then you will be looking more around the remote function calls or the APIs. In SAP terminology, we call it like a BAPI, right, Business Application Programming Interface. So those are SAP provides for most of the business processes. You would see that SAP provides standard APIs or BAPIs or RFCs, but then you would need to go and find out which one is the right BAPI or RFC to use for an automation you're looking to achieve, right? So accordingly, you can either use the standard APIs or you can also customize your APIs if need be, but it depends on the use case, right? So I'll touch upon briefly in the demo how to look up for an RFC, how to find out the standard RFCs in the system, but there are that's where we're going to touch upon some of this in that topic. And then in this slide, it's more a demo slide, but I wanted to call out here as to what type of packages you need to install. I'll show it in the system also. And then some of the prerequisites and the GUI setup, which you may have, I highly recommend enabling some of those features to make it much smoother automation. And then some of the use cases we're going to touch today, like how to log on, how to use the log on versus login activity to log into SAP. Like I said earlier, how to use the SAP, if you have to execute some SAP program using GUI automation, how to do that versus the same program calling an API. How does it make the difference between the performance and that? So that's what I'm going to touch upon in this demo. So that's all from a slide standpoint. I'm going to quickly stop sharing and jump into my system, and then just give me 1 second. All right. So this is our standard SAP system in my company. So I'm just going to use some of that to quickly talk about. Before we jump into UiPath, I want to just highlight few things in SAP as to from a developer standpoint. How do you look up the first thing is, if you want to automate based on an APIs or an RFC, how do you find out what type of APIs are out there? What type of remote function calls are out there? There are many ways of finding it, but one standard way which typically I use is to look up for a table called, there's a table in SAP called TF-DIR. And that basically gives you all type of RFCs out there. For example, if you want to create a read table, right? So you can find out there are standard RFC called RFC_read table. You can directly use that to read. And I'll show you how to use it from a UiPath standpoint, but just wanted to at least say that how to look up for an RFC. If you have a certain need, you can just quickly search for that, and then you can start from there. Like in my company, we had to customize it. You can see that we created Z_RFC. There was a need, special need, which a standard RFC did not serve for us. So we end up creating a custom RFC, but then your starting point could be one of the standard RFCs, and then you can accordingly customize it. And then if you have to, let's say, create a sales order, you see that there are many standard SAP BAPIs to create a sales order. That could be a good starting point for you to consider. If your automation is to use a bot to create sales orders in SAP as unattended or attended, you can start looking into some of these functions or RFCs in the system and customize it as needed, right? So I just wanted to quickly touch on that. I'm going to now switch into the UiPath, the main topic, so this is, before we look into the activities, I want to highlight some of the packages which you typically would need to add for any of the SAP automation. So the three main packages which are required. One is, of course, the UiPath packages, the UI automation.activities. That's one which you would need to install. And the other two are more SAP specific. One of them is the SAP BAPI activities. UiPath launched that last year to allow standard connectors to connect to SAP, as well as to call any RFC or BAPI directly from a studio automation. So that's the second one. The third one is, if you're looking for another solution like SAP SuccessFactors, right? So that's another HRIS system. So now there's a standard package for SuccessFactors as well, if you want to automate some of the HRIS functions, right? So these are some of the packages which you would need to enable to start working on the SAP automation. Once you enable these packages, you would see that if I search on my SAP here, there are standard activities. I'll quickly touch upon some of these. There are standard activities UiPath provide to log into SAP in order to select the SAP menu item to do any action on that. So these are some of the standard activities which are pretty useful. Instead of you writing your own custom activity, I highly recommend to pick one of these standard activities to do a specific task in SAP. And same from a SuccessFactors standpoint, there are standard activities where you can insert a record, you can call an employee data, you can update the employee data, your comp information, once you start the SuccessFactors integration, you see that every object of SuccessFactors is exposed into UiPath, and then you can pick based on your requirement. So those are with the packages you install, the starting point is to make sure that you have all the SAP BAPI related activities as well as the other non-BAPI related activities added on your standard activity package here, right? So that's the quick starting point before you start writing any studio automation there. So now just from a very simple login standpoint, right? So the first thing you have to do is log into the system, and there's a standard activity called SAP logon. In our company, we have single sign-on enabled. What it means is if I go to SAP GUI, I just double click on that and use system name, and then that connects me to SAP. And that's the same which is supported basically through an SAP logon activity. Once you know the connection name, I'm sure if you're SAP user, you know the connection name is what you refer here in your SAP GUI with the server settings as to which system you want to connect to. And we call this as a connection name. You need to know this connection name in order to establish the login to SAP. So this activity, if I run it, it will just launch my production system, which is what I was using there to log into SAP, right? So that's a very standard SAP logon activity to log into SAP. However, in some cases, like we have a use case where I do not want to use single sign-on to log into SAP, where I may be using a system account to do some automation, right? If I'm using a single sign-on, that means it's technically taking my user ID to log into SAP, but the transactions which we want to use from the automation standpoint, I cannot use my account, right? In that case, we may have system account. So if you have a system account, you can still use the standard activity called SAP login. Of course, you would have to store some credentials somewhere. I highly recommend using Orchestrator asset to store the system credentials, and you can read those credentials and then log into SAP. And then in that case, you would have to use a combination of both SAP logon and login. Basically, you're launching the SAP GUI, and then you're using your credentials to log into SAP. So basically, based on the requirement, you can decide whether to use SAP logon or SAP login based on how the use case you have. But UiPath provides both the options to log into SAP. On the next one is more to show about if we have to now, the next use case we can take up is, now that you're logged into SAP, you have to execute a program or you have to execute some task in SAP, right? That's where the true interaction comes in from a studio, from a bot standpoint. So once you logged into SAP, I'll show you two variations to do the same thing. One is if you're automating using UI UX, where the bot is going to log into SAP, go to SAP GUI, call a program, and then execute that program. That's all. Like on a user machine, a bot is running and SAP is logged in, and then the transaction is executed. The second way of doing is through a backend API call. So I'll show you how to connect to a backend standpoint. The same thing, but you can do it in the backend also, right? The first way is the UI UX way, right? So where you log into SAP and you can clearly see the dependencies. If it is coming to the front end, you have to have the SAP GUI installed on a user machine. And the bot has to be able to log into the SAP GUI also in order to log into SAP to execute a transaction. That means you still have to bring in the SAP logon, SAP login kind of activities, and then use one of these activities, the call transaction. What it does is, if you are familiar with the SAP process, in SAP terminology, we call every process a transaction, right? Like every process is given a transaction code in SAP. So then you need to know which transaction you're executing. So I'm saying, okay, call transaction, execute this transaction code called SA38, which is technically to run a program in SAP. And then you type in your program name, and then you select some variant, and then you execute. So basically, it's a 3 or 4 step process to execute a program. When it logs into SAP, call a transaction, type in the program name, and then execute the program, right? So that's a typical one use case you can think of, right? But highly, I'm using most of it. We're using the standard SAP activities provided by UiPath, how to select the menu item, how to select the type into, how to execute a program, right? On the other side, and so far in this case, we just relying heavily on the SAP package we installed, and that enabled us to use the standard SAP activities. On the same thing, if I want to do this the same automation using a BAPI call, what it does is, you can see it's much simpler. It's just one activity here, right? There is no logon or login required because it's directly connecting to the backend on the server side So this is typically how you would configure it. Like if you have to configure coming into SAP, like what is your server name, right? Every SAP server has a server name or a system number, system ID, which username you want to use to connect to that. If it's a single sign-on or without single sign-on, you'll accordingly change your settings here. If there's no single sign-on, you want to still enter your username password, then you can use that. In our case, it's single sign-on, so I'm using log on with the SNC identity, and then the SNC and all. Like if you don't know this information, I'm sure your basis SAP administrator is the right one to tell you. As a RPA developer, we probably won't know all these details, but you would have to work with the SAP administrator to get you the information around all the server IDs and the login information, right? So this is a starting point. Once you connect here, then you use a standard activity called like SAP invoke SAP BAPI, right? Once you do that, it basically gives you access to call any, once you, like in my earlier example, if I switch back to this one, once you know these RFCs, right? If I want to pick this one and copy that and then paste here and search it, it basically gives you access to all the standard function calls SAP provides, which are remote enabled, right? Once you get that BAPI defined here, then it tells you how to use it like any typical function call, right? It has some input arguments, it has some output arguments. So you have to define those, like what is, and as an input or an output function here. And once you define that, and then it's up to you within your, once it come out of this activity, the data is transferred out of SAP, then it's up to you how you want to handle the data. If you're reading a data from SAP, you can call read table RFC, and once the data is inside of UiPath into a data table, then it's up to you how you want to use that data into Excel or whatever is the requirement. But this one activity is helping you to make a connection to SAP, get the data, or execute a process in SAP and capture the return parameters for you to further take any action on that from that standpoint. Right? So the same thing, what we were doing earlier with this one, I was able to do it in as, I'm just calling a program with this BAPI called zcall program. It takes a program name and there are certain parameters and then execute it, and then it just finished within a second. The same thing which does here in 6 to 7 steps. Right? So that's it. Standard invoke SAP BAPI. All I was using here was just drag and drop here and then configure that, and then inside the application scope, and then start using whichever BAPI you want to use for that automation. What else? I'm trying to see my yeah, there's one other thing I want to just highlight more from my lessons learned and the ease perspective. Like if you are looking from a GUI automation perspective, there are a couple of prerequisites I highly suggest you should consider. One is, if you're familiar with the SAP GUI settings on the options here, it's always recommended to enable the scripting because that's how the SAP script and the coding enables you to get access to every screen element on the screen and make it easier from a selector standpoint, right? So it's always recommended to enable scripting so that the UiPath screen scraping or a data scraping can easily interact with all the screen elements you have on the screen, right? So that's one setting, definitely recommend that. And then the other thing which you may have to do, just to quickly show you that setting, working with your basis administrator, you also need to turn on the user level scripting. And it's all there in the, if you go to the UiPath documentation, there is a SAP help guide over there that talks about the prerequisites and how to set up the scripting, and it's all taught. It gives you all the stuff. But those are also the prerequisites you would have to enable if you're looking to do GUI-based automation versus the API-based automation. So it depends on the requirement. Accordingly, there are certain prerequisites either way, you may have to do it. That's pretty much it, what I wanted to quickly touch upon. I know there's a much broader, bigger topic, but today we want to keep more high level, just to at least wanted to share some of the prerequisites, how to get started on the automation, what to consider, what type of use cases, or when to choose GUI versus API. And then we can always get into deeper discussions as we feel in a later time. So with that said, we'll take the Q&A later if there are any questions out there, but but I want to, in the spirit of time, hand it over to Mukesh, to you, to take it from a ServiceNow perspective.
Thank you, Rahul. It was really insightful to see the SAP. So I'll just start my screen sharing, and please let me know if you guys are able to see my screen. I am just.
You got it.
Yep. Okay, I'll just. Okay. Are you guys able to see the Snow integration headers? Okay. So first of all, somebody of you might be new to the integration part. So the first thing which I want to introduce here is what exactly is a ServiceNow. So whenever we are working for any client, any customer, and once the automation is mature enough, we have more and more robots which are deployed in production. Now, whenever you have a situation where the robots are breaking in production, now you have a support team which is continuously monitoring your orchestrator, your robots and server. So what they do, whenever there is an incident happening, or in there is the bot is not working as expected, they usually generate incidents. It may be of different priority, P1, P2, P3, right? If you are coming from a software background or any technology background, this is the same concept, that where exactly the team is going and just creating the incident that, okay, this robot has failed. This robot has got some exception. Now the question arises, why they can't directly fix it, right? Why do they need to create an incident? The simple answer is, we want to track that how stable is my automation, how stable is the orchestrator. At the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, we just simply pull out the report from the ServiceNow and we say that, okay, this process has got 50 incidents, this process has got 20 incidents, this is not stable. The other reason is, whenever as a production support you have to go and you have to fix something, you require application accesses. So you might need to get the machine password or the robot account password. So anybody if directly goes and get the password, that might breach the compliance. So they go backup of an incident. They say that, okay, I have got this incident. That's why I am going and I'm creating an incident, right? So that is how the ServiceNow thing works. But now why exactly this integration come in picture? One side, we are telling that we have deployed the robots, we have freed the human resources and the robot is doing. The other side, I am telling someone to keep continuously monitoring the orchestrator. So as of now, if I have 30 robots, 40 robots, 50 robots, I cannot just keep somebody sitting monitoring the ServiceNow. Incident is happening, orchestrator is monitoring, incident is happening, going to ServiceNow, creating the incidents. So that is where this integration comes in picture, which simply means that how exactly can I simply integrate UiPath with the ServiceNow. Now, this slides talk about UiPath is integrated to ServiceNow in two ways. The first way is, whenever there is an incident or any exception happening on any of the robots in orchestrator, it will directly hit your ServiceNow and it will create an incident on your behalf. Now, as an user, as a business user, as a developer, you have an option and a capability to set that, okay, what is the application name? What is the priority of the incident? Whom do I want to assign this incident to? So that is the first part, which means that we can actually create incidents via UiPath orchestrators. The second integration is that whenever there is an exception which has happened in a process, and now from ServiceNow you want to trigger a robot. So there is an incident which has created by a Java application, or there is an incident which has been created by a .NET application, and the incident is landing in the ServiceNow queue. Now from the ServiceNow queue, you can actually go and trigger a robot in the orchestrator. that will actually go and start any of the processes which the guy is manually doing, right? So that is how the ServiceNow integration is done. You can either create the incident, or from the ServiceNow, that is the Snow API, you can actually go and hit the orchestrator and trigger the job as well, right? So that is how what this slide talks about. Moving forward, these are the two connectors which are available. So UiPath works on the concept of connectors and the API. We have ServiceNow connector. So if you have a background of, let's say, Excel automation, if I have to do an Excel automation, I require something which is called Excel application scope. I tell UiPath that yes, I am going to do an Excel automation. Similarly, if I have to do a ServiceNow automation, I simply tell UiPath that, okay, this is the ServiceNow activity pack which I want to use, and I'm telling UiPath that yes, I'm going to do the ServiceNow automation. Now, this is how this entire integration work. You have something which is the ServiceNow, which is the number one, which is called the setup. From the ServiceNow, I go to the ServiceNow admin and I get something which is called the client ID and the client secret ID. Now the question arises, why do I require a client ID and client secret ID? There may be multiple instances of ServiceNow which are running in an organization. Which ServiceNow to hit, which level of incident I have to create, I need to get those details. So that detail I directly get from the setup of the ServiceNow. The second thing is, once I have got the ServiceNow OATH, I would require two things. The first thing I would require is the client ID and the client secret ID. This is for the ServiceNow. The second thing I would require is the username and the password. Now this username is the password, and the password is for the user who is going to create the incident. So basically we simply create a user in the ServiceNow. Let's say for a robot account, I create robot ABC and I get it a username, I get it a password. So these are the two set of credential which I require. I'm going to show you how exactly can I get both of them. And the last thing is, once you have actually get all of this credential, you simply go to your UiPath, you build a project, and you provide this detail to the ServiceNow scope. So this is how this integration look like. The best part about the ServiceNow is that ServiceNow has a community version as well, which means that if you want to have a hands-on of the ServiceNow integration with UiPath, you can do it right away also. You just have to go to this website, which is called developer.servicenow.com. As you can see, I have taken the screenshot. Rahul can share this text at the end. So you just have to go to this website, developer.servicenow.com. You have to mention your details and you have to just create an instance for you. What would happen? It will send an email to you. This I have done freshly. So it is saying me that you have created a developer account for the ServiceNow. Now, once you have the developer account, you can actually log into ServiceNow and click on something which is called request instance. I am telling ServiceNow that give me a ServiceNow instance, which would have some dummy tickets, some dummy information. Now, once my instance is ready, all I have to do is go and open the ServiceNow. Till this point, I have not contacted UiPath. This is all only related to ServiceNow. So this is how the ServiceNow admin actually looks in an enterprise. Now, this is the place where I'm going to tell first ServiceNow that I am going to install a plugin of UiPath on top of you. And I want you to give me the information such as client ID, the client information, which I'll take back to UiPath. So how do we do that? We go to plugin in the ServiceNow. There is something which is called OATH 2.0. You can just follow this step. Once you go here, you have to first activate. By default, it is activated. In case if it is not active, you just have to toggle the flag off. Once this is done, I have to create an application registry for my UiPath, which means that I want ServiceNow to allow UiPath to create incidents, right? So I'll go to new. I'll create an OATH API endpoint for the external client. Since UiPath is an external client for this one, ServiceNow, I'll click on this one. It will ask me to provide a name. This name could be anything. I have given a name such as Snow UiPath. As soon as I provide this, this is the place where I will get a client ID. This means that ServiceNow is telling me that this is the ID which I have created for UiPath. I'll hit submit and my OATH request would be created. Now this is the place where I will get a client ID and a client secret ID. which means that ServiceNow is now telling me that Mukesh, you have got this client ID, you have got this secret ID. If you use this, I would accept that request. That's it, right? Moving forward, it is asking me that which is the orchestrator or which is the provisioning environment which is going to hit the service now. So here you have to provide the cloud.uipath.com provisioning URL. So this actually can be your orchestrator enterprise URL. I am using the UiPath community edition, so I provided cloud.uipath.com. Now, once I have got the client ID, I have got the client secret ID. Two things I require is the ServiceNow username and the ServiceNow password. This ServiceNow username and the ServiceNow password is exactly the same password of the ServiceNow instance. Which ServiceNow instance you want to create, you want to hit UiPath with. A better option, always a good practice, is that we can always create a separate username and a password dedicated to the reboot. Now, since it is a credential, we cannot keep it in a config file, plain notepad file. So our best practice is we always put this thing in orchestrator assets. In your orchestrator, you are going to have three things now. The one thing would be the ServiceNow URL, username and the password of the ServiceNow instance, and the client ID and the client secret ID, which you will get from the ServiceNow. Once you have all these details, see, I have just got and created two assets in my orchestrator. So this is my UiPath orchestrator screenshot where I have created two assets with these details. To work with the ServiceNow, I need to tell my UiPath Studio that I am doing the ServiceNow automation. So I require the activities which are available for doing the ServiceNow. Now the activity pack is uipath.servicenow.activity. The version which I am using is 1.2.4. Depending on your version and whatever you have available, it might change, but the overall architecture looks like the same, right? So once your ServiceNow is configured, you have got these two details. You have come to your UiPath Studio. You have to import one dependencies, which is called servicenow.activities. Once you import this, you can see that all of these details which are available, I can actually go and ServiceNow, I can get the ServiceNow record, I can insert the ServiceNow record, I can update the tickets as well, right? So all these options are available. Similarly, as Rahul was showing, right? So when we do any integration, the thing is exactly the same. I have a ServiceNow application scope, which I drag and drop in UiPath. It asks me for the endpoint URL, the username, the password of the instance, the client ID, and the client secret ID. I provide all the details and I hit connect, and it says that your connection was successful. In case of any exception, you will directly get the error here. Now, in the real-time scenario, all of this user ID, password, client ID, and all of this has to be stored in the orchestrator assets, right? So this is just to show you that how actually when you are configuring it for the first time, I need to validate, right? So this is how the validation is done. Once your ServiceNow and UiPath are connected, you have an activities. You have to drag and drop an activity in UiPath, and you just have to click on the configure, and that's it. Incident would be directly created. Now let me quickly go back to my UiPath Studio. I'll pull up my UiPath Studio here like this. Okay. So I have already got the four things from the ServiceNow. You might get it from the ServiceNow instance. In your UiPath Studio, in the project, you have to include this activity, which is called uipath.servicenow.activity package. As soon as I import it, if you go to the activities, you would have something inside the integration, app integration, and you would here, let me just quickly open this one in the integration, ServiceNow, and you have all these options available, right? ServiceNow object, delete, update, as the name suggests, right? You can actually go and update multiple records as well. Now to work on the first thing, you need to first provide a scope, right? So you need to provide a scope, which means that which instance I want to work with. So this is the ServiceNow application scope, which we have to drag and drop in the first place. As soon as I drag and drop, it is going to ask me few details that you tell me what is the username, what is the password, which is the client ID, and what is the secret ID. All of those things I have already stored in the orchestrator. So I just use an activity called get credential. The output of the get credential becomes the input for the ServiceNow application scope. Now inside this scope, you can actually go and directly use activities such as insert the ServiceNow record, update the ServiceNow record, right? So now if I'm running this automation, it will create an incident in the ServiceNow. Now the question arises in my actual code where I will call this. Whenever an code is generating an exception, whenever there is an automation and you have used the try catch, in the catch, whenever there is an exception which requires an assistant from the server, or which require an assistant from the service now, or which require an assistant from the production support guy, you can create an incident for him. As soon as the incident is created, it will create and log an incident in his queue. An email will be triggered so that don't need to monitor the orchestrator. The other thing is, once this incident is created, I have a provision to directly trigger some other job also. So that is also possible. So that was about the integration of Snow. Something which we have actually some learnings which I want to share before you implement the service now in your company, right? This I have done in my community edition. Make sure you have the provision of getting the client secret ID and the client ID. You have an option to enable the OATH. Sometimes because of the security, because of the uh, infrastructure you are dealing with, people might not provide you the information from the production support. So if you are planning to implement this in the enterprise level, first speak to the ServiceNow admin of your company and ask them that are they willing to provide you the client ID, the client secret ID, and will they allow UiPath to create an incident? Why we are asking? Because if something happens on the robot and the robot started creating more and more incidents, that becomes a problem for them, right? So we need to have that clarity first thing. If everything is good, the integration is absolutely simple. Just a single activity configuration works flawlessly. So I would like to take a pause, and that was about the ServiceNow integration. Open for any questions, any queries. Back to you, Rahul. I can stop my sharing now. Yep.
This is great. Thanks, Mukesh. Perfect. So let's go in the chat. I'm just going to start scrolling up to see if there's any questions. I know, Scott, you had around SAP documentation. We shared some links to you. I think I would suggest that's a good starting point, Scott, to start reading about the SAP integration. There are a couple of blog articles, Scott, which I have also written on the UiPath blog around how to start the automation. You may want to refer those also. So there are a lot of documentation out there to get you started. Your question around AF4 reporting, I haven't personally used, since we don't have this the SAP Analytics Cloud in my company. I cannot comment directly on that, but knowing how SSE work, it should be possible. Like it's a similar, like we have done a similar automation in terms of Tableau and other analytics. My guess is even the SAP Analytics Cloud should be possible through the UiPath, but I don't think there are any standard accelerators or standard activities to do that. But you should be able to use the standard other activities and screen scraping and web-based automation to use from an AF4 reporting standpoint as well. And then Mukesh, there's a question on the ServiceNow from Alan. Do you want to take that one?
Yes, Rahul. So Alan asked, is the application registry in the ServiceNow impacted by cloning of the ServiceNow instance? Do registry get overwritten by cloning the activities? So Alan, I think this question is more specific to the ServiceNow, that if you clone the ServiceNow instance, that what happens to the registries. So I'm not an expert in the ServiceNow, but if you have any questions regarding to the integration, that I can answer, or if I have misunderstood, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, thanks, Mukesh. I realize it's specific to ServiceNow. What happens if I'm on a dev instance and try to play around with UiPath and registering it, and I may not be done yet, would it be overwritten through because of frequent upgrades by ServiceNow, it maybe get overwritten.
No. So this integration is working with the help of APIs. So that is the best part about APIs. In case the underlying structure and the update happens, there is no update in the API, right? So that is what it is the best part. So in UiPath, whenever we do something, we have always two options. You do with the help of the UI automation, with the help of clicks, with the help of type into. Whenever there is an update happening, you have to remodify the application. Whenever there is an update happening in the application and you are using API, the API and the services don't get impacted, right? So that is why always the first option is to prefer the API and the backend things rather than going to the UI automation. Okay, so the answer is no. In case of the update, it won't get impacted. Rahul, you want to add something over there?
No, I think it's the same, like I said on the
Yes.
SAP side. I think
Exactly. Yeah.
Any application with the backend is always considered to be the safe from a day-to-day patching and upgrades standpoint, because those are much more stable solutions out there compared to UI UX. So I think ServiceNow, SAP, APIs, the RFCs, I think is much more stable and recommended approach.
Yep.
Thank you.
I hope that answers, Alan. Yep.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. I don't see any other question on the chat, but if there's any other question out there, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, looks like there's no other questions. So this is good. Thanks for joining today. Thanks, Mukesh. And then just one announcement from a Philadelphia chapter standpoint. We are still looking into the schedule, but we are planning a couple of in-person sessions in the next month or so. Like one event we're planning first week of June to be more like an in-person event somewhere in the King of Prussia area, and then we'll be looking another later in the summertime. So look out for those announcements on the chapter page, on the UiPath events page, and as we finalize the details, we'll put more out there for you to start registering for it. But we're definitely looking for in-person opportunity now in the next month or two for us to get together. So. Okay, with that said, thank you. Thanks for joining, and then have a rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.